pulls water. It's really just for collecting water.
That's the sound of lab work at the Center for Genomics and Systems Biology at New York University, and Aidan Wells, a first-year PhD student studying RNA biology, showing off the equipment.
Vortexer for mixing. You mix tubes like this.
Aidan, who also happens to be my brother, says work here continues, and for him, the lab feels almost normal, even though it's far from it.
Here's another centrifuge, a smaller one.
Recently, the Trump administration has upended the scientific community, with cuts to the NIH, layoffs at the National Science Foundation, and much more. Has left many scientists uncertain about their future.
I'm Henry. I'm a first-year PhD student.
Henry Molkheimer is another first-year student working in the center. Henry and Aidan think their entry into graduate school feels particularly surreal. Not just as the start of their career, but as the final cohort admitted before Trump's sweeping cuts.
Without funding for administrators or sequencing resources or computing resources, it'd be difficult to accomplish the same amount.
Especially concerning that this might affect underrepresented communities.
They are also concerned that political ideology will play more of a role in what research gets supported.
There's an effort to remove any inclusive language from any type of scientific publication, particularly grant and fellowship applications, which means that people have to police themselves in advance for including words like diversity or equity, leading to self-censorship and lower quality research.
There will be lasting effects on the amount of good science that's getting done. All that important work that has been done is in jeopardy. We're sort of entering into a time where the objectivity of science becomes compromised.
Henry and Aidan worry that it may be hard to reestablish trust in science if attacks and negative rhetoric continue over the next 4 years.
People often don't see the bigger picture of how much the world has been changed by science and by people researching things that are not immediately applicable to something like treating human disease. The world that we live in today is a product of a long history of scientific progress, and that shouldn't be minimized.
Henry thinks it's important for future students to realize just how much the sciences have changed.
If you really love it, you should push, and there still will be some opportunity, and it's not all going away, but I would always keep a backup plan in mind, because there's just not the amount of opportunities anymore.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Henry and Aidan work in the same lab as Duncan Smith, an associate professor in biology who runs a small lab almost entirely funded through the NIH. Dr. Smith looks at DNA replication and repair, studying the effects on yeast so that we can better understand humans.
These processes are sort of very deeply conserved, and so if it happens in yeast, it pretty much happens in humans, which is...
Dr. Smith is worried about the people who work in his lab. As part of the NIH cuts, the support cap was dropped from 70 to just 15%.
So that would represent a 4-fold reduction. Those indirect costs pay for the facilities and the administration. Without those costs, our department does not operate. NYU is already paying 40 cents on the dollar for every dollar of science it does, and that would require NYU to pay 85 cents per dollar, which would make it unsustainable.
While Dr. Smith does think to some degree those caps could come down, he knows firsthand the danger of doing it overnight.
My prior grant ended on February 28th, and the new grant should have started March 1st. It had been approved, it had been read in huge detail by 3 experts, and then it's been sitting there since December 4th, 2024. So I am now operating without a grant. That grant pays for the salaries of everyone in the lab. I have residual startup funds which will float us for about 3.5 months. And if we don't get any more money at that point, I will be unable to meet salary obligations for the people in my lab.
He fears these cuts and closures could negatively affect future opportunities for PhD students.
About 20% of scientists in the NIH itself are tenured, and there was a new policy announced that no rolling contracts would be renewed going forward, which means that over the course of 4 years, the size of the NIH intramural workforce will be reduced by 80%. That is consistent with it being a broader attack on the NIH. If there's a critical mass of labs that close, then I would be tremendously worried about opportunities for PhD students. It's hard to imagine where the PhD students go. I have a PhD student in my lab whose work requires stuff that costs money. If I've spent all my balances down to zero, then that student's PhD work becomes impossible without external help. And if you scale that by 13 PhD students a year, it's problematic.
Dr. Smith says if there's one thing he could tell the university, it would be to increase their level of communication.
There have been cumulatively 2 emails from the university administration. So we're 6 weeks in and there have been 2 emails, and that response feels insufficient. Its absence has been pretty striking.
As of now, Dr. Smith thinks the cone of uncertainty is so large that it's hard to give meaningful advice. Normally he tells PhD hopefuls to keep their options open, but now he's not even sure what those options look like. He says if he were still in that stage of his career, he would be angry. From the Center for Genomics and Systems Biology, this has been Chase Wells for New York University.